The Queen is coming north. The good news and excitement was rising as the appointed day approached. Over hill and plain, over swamp and farmland, over forest, stream and wide river, over the whole 232,000 square miles, the glad tidings went out. The Queen, accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh, was coming to see this great land for herself and the 18 millions of people who dwell here. The vast majority, the farmers, work in the fields, raising crops not only to feed themselves and their families, but also from their surplus to bring wealth to the north. For the dyers by the dye pits and the traders in the markets, there was but one topic of conversation. The Queen was coming, and all the splendor of the north was to be hers in loyal greeting. Everyone had a welcome ready for the royal visitors. Alas, not all would be able to see them, but the less fortunate would hear from those who had, and would see pictures of their Queen against a familiar background. Our life has gone on almost unchanged for hundreds of years, but history and modernity have blended together and modern methods have been adopted, with one lorry carrying the loads of 50 donkeys 15 times as quickly. Even the children had heard the news, and in the breaks they were all talking about it and wondering whether they would be going to Kaduna to see her. To Kaduna, and most of them had never left their homes before. Certainly now was not the time for lessons. Playing and dancing were much, much better. On Wednesday, February the 1st, 6 days after leaving London, the Queen was flying over Northern Territory. Below, on the airport, all was in readiness. The long runways were about to receive the royal plane. It was a moment of tense excitement for everybody who was in Kaduna that day. The 350-mile flight from Lagos was nearly over, and the Queen was soon to set foot in northern Nigeria. Sharp on time, the Viking aircraft of the Queen's flight came in. His Excellency the Governor went out to receive and welcome Her Majesty. A moment of suspense, and there she was, radiant in spite of her journey and the strenuous days which she had spent in Lagos. Sir Brian and Lady Sharwood Smith welcomed the royal visitors. The Duke wore the uniform of a Marshal of the Royal Air Force, and a salute of 21 guns thundered out. The royal honor, and a signal that the Queen was really there at last. The cool breeze of Kaduna must have been a welcome relief after the steaming heat of Lagos. The beautiful weather matched the greatness of the occasion, the first time that a reigning sovereign had set foot in the northern region of Nigeria. The memory of this day will live long. After the royal salute, the Queen was to inspect the guard of honor. As at Lagos, it was mounted by the Nigeria regiment, later to be the Queen's own. These men were from the 1st Battalion. The inspection over, Her Majesty moved to the pavilion where the Premier, the Honourable Alhaji Amadou, Sardauna of Sokoto, the Executive Council and the Chief Justice were to be presented. And now it was that the Air Force paid tribute, the roar of jets heralding the Canberra formation. The region's Premier, the Sardauna of Sokoto, obviously delighted with the occasion, saw the Queen and her husband leave for their triumphal drive to Government House.
The 6-mile route was lined with horsemen and crowds of people of all kinds. This was a part of the life of Nigeria which Her Majesty and the Duke had not experienced before. The brilliant colors, the gaily decorated horses, the trumpets and pipes, all combined to make the journey unforgettable. Her Majesty has traveled in many lands and visited many peoples. But surely she can never have known anything quite like this before. The North was greeting its Queen, and how royally they did it. Hundreds of dusty miles were forgotten as they acclaimed her. Those 6 miles took nearly an hour to cover, but every moment of it was terrific. The gates at last, but not to rest. The afternoon was to be spent in watching a polo match, and in the evening a state dinner was held in Government House, at which were present her Executive Council, together with the Chief Justice, the President of the Assembly, the Brigadier commanding the district, and their wives.
But the next day was really the most important of all, for this was when the Durbar was held. From an early hour, vast crowds converged on the racecourse in Kaduna, which had been transformed for the occasion. 50,000 people watched the display, in which 6,500 men took part with over 2,000 horses and camels. Later, Her Majesty was to express her appreciation in these words: "The presence of so many of you from every part of this vast region is a tribute to your loyal feelings, which I greatly value." The previous evening, the Queen and the Duke had paid an informal visit to the great Durbar camp. There they were seen and welcomed by many of those who were to take part. It was a charming gesture, and one which sprang from their real interest in the people of the region and their desire to see as much as they could in the time. But now, back to the racecourse, where excitement was rising as the time for Her Majesty's arrival drew nearer. The Guard of Honor and the massed bands of the NA Police and the Nigeria Regiment marched onto the field. They were to play an important part in the ceremonies which followed. Then, escorted by the mounted NA police, the royal car drove onto the Durbar ground. Again, the weather was perfect, cool and dry with just a touch of harmattan. Just the day, in fact, for an occasion such as this. As the royal car came in, it passed the guns and men of the 1st West African Field Battery, exercising their privilege of guarding the sovereign. First, the Queen and the Duke were to drive round and inspect the provincial contingents. Back once more at the pavilion, Sir Brian Sharwood Smith bade the Queen and His Royal Highness welcome, and the cheers of thousands added their spontaneous greeting. Now the Guard Commander invited the royal inspection, and the Duke, with the Queen's approval, set off to do so. Men of the 4th Battalion were in its ranks, and Prince Philip, who wore naval uniform, was conducted by the officer of the Guard with the Sub-District Commander Brigadier Brown in attendance. The Brigadier wore white ceremonial uniform. Slowly they passed down the ranks of men who serve in a regiment whose color carries many battle honors. Ashanti, in 1873 and 4, and again in 1900. East Africa and the Cameroons in the First World War, and East Africa again in the Second. No one will ever forget the great drive up the mountains of Abyssinia, or their great service with the 81st and 82nd Divisions in Burma and India. Then His Royal Highness returned to the pavilion, there to watch with the Queen and the Premier a procession which must surely have been the most colourful to be staged anywhere during this or any other royal tour. First, the Nigeria Regiment Band and the Guard of Honour marched off. Already in Lagos, Her Majesty had admired the bearing of the regiment, and today the 4th Battalion and the band gave her another example of their smartness on parade.
Then the great parade began, and province by province, the emirs and chiefs of the region paid their royal tribute. First, Plateau, led by Orang Pam, a schoolmaster who became a chairman of a council, and then chief of the bureau. 350 men and 34 horses represented all the chiefs and peoples of the many tribes of the plateau, with dancers, musicians, drummers, and singers. This great spectacle was like a page of Nigeria's history. But now, the raiders and the raided marched together in common friendship and with a common cause. The soldiers and the cavalrymen had their day again. The bright swords were brandished, the gleaming spears were shaken, but all in a glorious festivity. Flagman from ancient Daura led the Katsina contingent as it passed in allegiance before Her Majesty. There were 660 representatives of the two emirates in this great parade, and there were 300 horses and, don't forget, the camels. In addition, the Emir of Katsina brought along his 9-year-old grandson to pay his respects to Her Majesty. Superbly dignified in spite of his youth, taking his place with his elders on this most tremendous of all occasions. And there's the Emir himself, saluting Her Majesty with the famous sword of his ancestors. Adamawa next, men of many tribes from the high mountains and the banks of the great river, and at their head the Fulani Emir, a descendant of the man who gave his name to their province. Yes, it was a proud moment indeed to represent your kinsfolk on Durbar Day. Had one of the two largest contingents. Gummel was there, and so were his neighbors, Hadejah and Kazauri. Brought along his camel drummers, and his followers were dressed in the chainmail which was worn by the Crusaders in olden times. All the medieval history of Nigeria was here in Kaduna, in a 20th century tribute of allegiance. They were even summoned from their marshalling points by wireless. Bornu, representing the Kanuri, Fulani and Shuar Arabs, the chiefs and people from the dizzy escarpments of Bu, the plains of Pika and the swamps of Bede. The 84-year-old Shehu was there, of course. Lugard appointed him Shehu Dikwa in 1917, and today he still led his men on horseback. My Pika, with his streaming beard, and my Bu, led the great gallop at the Durbar's end. now the bowmen of Sokoto, leading 1,200 men and 500 horses, a contingent only equaled in size by Kanu. The Sultan, the Saracen Musalmi himself, had left his seat by the Queen to pay this tribute in company with the 3 other Sokoto emirs. This was the last of the great provincial contingents, which had all combined in equal measure to give the Queen perhaps the greatest day which he can ever have known. Then came the final Jahi, with horsemen charging to within 20 yards of the royal pavilion. Three times they came. A magnificent spectacle, the Queen called it, and who would wish to deny it? Loudspeakers placed around the arena enabled everyone to hear Her Majesty speak.
You will maintain all that is good in them. You have greeted my husband and myself in a noble manner, and we shall always cherish the memory of the happy welcome which you have given to us. I sincerely thank you all.
And so the greatest of great Durbars was over. The northern peoples had combined to put on a show worthy of their fine traditions and history. The old had blended with the new to give the royal visitor an unforgettable picture of the pomp and gaiety, the pageantry and the dancing, which is Nigeria. Their departure ended the official program, but rejoicing went on far into the night.